Welcome to Living Out Loud with your host, Jess Phillips, where we talk all things addictions, codependency, relationships, and the good, bad, and ugly in between. Hi, everybody. My name is Jess Phillips. I'm super grateful you're here. I'm a master's level clinician and a relationship and attachment trauma coach. I help freedom-seeking women regain their confidence, master their triggers, and communicate their needs so they can finally put an end to toxic relationships, low self-worth, feeling like an imposter, and become more authentic, trusting, and secure. I know exactly what it feels like to be spinning in circles, stuck in obsession, and living life with all or nothing thinking. After years of failed relationships, impulsive decisions, yo-yo dieting, and riding emotional roller coasters, I knew I needed to get to the root of my issues and that I couldn't go on like this any longer. And that's exactly why I created the 10-week Secure Self-Coaching Program. I was tired of wasting time and money on professionals that didn't understand me. And I knew that trying to fix my own problems with the same thinking that got me there wasn't going to help me get any closer to my goals. If this sounds like you, feel free to send me a message and we'll set up a free consultation call to see if my program is right for you. You can find the link to my website in the show notes. Now back to the show. Enjoy. Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Living Out Loud with your host, Jess Phillips. We're going more chill vibes today. We're on the couch. We're relaxed. I can't handle recording these at my desk anymore, so we're getting creative with my tiny little condo studio. But here we are. So let's go. Today's episode, we are going to be covering the basics of attachment styles. I've come to the realization that I think because of going through and experiencing so much personal pain, I became this little researcher. And I remember around age 29 or 30, I just wanted to feel better. I literally felt insane. I was having such a difficult time in personal relationships and I wanted answers, and I'm quite relentless. And when I want something, I really go after it. So I kind of soaked up everything there is to know about attachment, about codependency, and just about relating to other people and what that looks like, especially when there's trauma involved and attachment trauma. So basically just kind of want to start at the beginning and provide the cliff notes on attachment styles. So it's kind of a little bit of a buzzword right now, and codependency has been for quite a while. But in the simplest form, attachment styles are something that was created out of research around the 70s by two researchers by the name of John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth. And they started to do experiments with very young children, I think under the age of 2, maybe under the age of 5. Probably experiments that definitely would not fly today. But what they were doing was they were placing kids under observation, and they would have the mother in the room with them as well. There would be toys, there would be some other children, and basically what they wanted to observe and study was the child's reaction after the mother was taken out of the room. And they came to this very interesting conclusion that based on the temperament of the different children, each child would behave differently. And out of that research and experiment and plenty others that followed that, came 4 basic attachment styles. Now, there are hybrid versions of these styles, and I can get into them in another podcast or maybe a little bit later. But just for the sake of Attachment Style 101 podcast and just keeping it simple, let's just stick to the 4. So the 4 being, we have secure attachment, we have anxious attachment, we have dismissive avoidant attachment, and the 4th one, disorganized attachment. So disorganized attachment, also known as fearful avoidant attachment, is basically a combination of anxious and avoidant. So let's start with secure.
So secure attachment, I often joke that the majority of people listening to this podcast might not find themselves super securely attached, but basically we are working our way towards that. So secure attachment is a term that's used to describe an individual or a child who experienced exactly that, a lot of security at home. So I've talked about this a little bit in previous podcasts, and again, it's not the be all end all perfect attachment style. And just as a caveat, these are not labels that we have to kind of wear on our sleeve. They really don't. They're just a way to describe a lot of the behaviors, symptoms, triggers, things that come up for people, mostly in romantic relationships. I do work with individuals where you see it come up in their friendships or with their colleagues or work relationships, but majoritively it's in romantic relationships. So securely attached individuals have the easiest time out of the four. So they've grown up in homes where their parents or their primary caregivers were very attuned to their emotional needs. So what that looks like is when the child cries for something or is experiencing something upsetting, could be bullying, could be, I don't know, weight gain, insecurity, things like that. The parent has the emotional capacity to support the child, especially when they're experiencing dysregulation. So what that means to the child, and the child grows up to believe that when there is a problem, when they are feeling uncomfortable, dysregulated, nervous, upset, that the home and the primary caregivers are a secure source for them to go to know that they're going to be listened to, that their needs are going to be met, and ultimately that they're going to get comfort from whatever situation that they're going through. So does that mean that somebody growing up in a secure household doesn't have any issues or fights with their parents or primary caregivers or whatever? No, not at all. People are normal, children are annoying. it they still get into arguments, they still fight with their parents, but for the bigger stuff, they're able to have these open emotional conversations with their family. So what happens when emotions are validated growing up and they're encouraged, and the parents maybe they're showing affection openly between them in front of the children. Maybe they're having healthy conflict in front of the children, because relationships are not about not fighting and not having conflict. It's about the repair that follows the rupture. The majority of the time, people get into a lot of trouble when there's a lot of rupture and no repair. So when parents can show children that, yes, okay, you can disagree, you can argue, you can fight, but then also look at this, we can repair the situation instead of sweeping it under the rug and then never talking about it again. So these children ultimately turn into adults who don't feel the need to hide their emotions. They feel quite comfortable being vulnerable. They grow up seeking a relationship like their parents had. Oftentimes, our parents are our first blueprint of love. That's what we're watching as kids, and oftentimes we begin to mirror that as we get older. So if we've had a healthy display of love growing up, then chances are we're going to have an easier time in relationships. So that's secure attachment. So in a nutshell, securely attached individuals ultimately feel that, say they go through something or they have a really bad day or they're feeling insecure about something in their relationship or they need to speak to somebody about something. Ultimately, they feel this kind of internal knowing that they're able to go to somebody and that somebody is going to be able to help them solve whatever issue it is. Once we get into the other styles, you'll see the discrepancy between a secure attachment and an anxious attachment, for example, or an avoidant attachment, where that same tape is not playing. Somebody who leans more anxious, for example, will experience the same issue, but they will dread the conversation. And a lot of the times they won't have the conversation because they fear that their needs aren't going to be met. And not because of their partner. I mean, it can be, but this is an old tape that's playing because when they experienced something when they were younger and then they went to their parents or they went to a primary caregiver, their needs were not met. So they've never had that feeling of safety and regulation before. So what ends up happening is that starts to get very projected in their current relationships, which causes a lot of rupture, and then the partner doesn't know how to repair it. So in a nutshell, just kind of wrapping up secure attachment before we move on. So again, comfortable with vulnerability, quite convinced that when they have a need, they're going to get their needs met. They don't feel insecure or fearful about telling somebody how they feel, or maybe that they like them, or whatever it is. They move through life pretty comfortable when we're talking about emotions or romantic relationships. Now, let's get into the meatier ones. So we'll start with anxious attachment, which is the one that I speak about the most. It's the one that I've struggled with personally the most. Well, I'm unfortunately category 4, which is more of a disorganized attachment. So I can really vacillate between anxious and avoidant behavior. But thank God for this work and the tools and skills that are developed through looking at these patterns, is that I get to, number one, surround myself with a lot more secure people today, which really helps my nervous system and also allows me to behave in a much more secure way when I feel more comfortable that my needs are going to be met when I ask for something. But that's for another episode. So anxious attachment. So what is that? So that can look like multiple different upbringings. So for example, a child growing up in a home where mom or dad is an alcoholic, let's say, or a drug addict. So what's happening now is the child is viewing very unstable behavior. There can be viewing a lot of hot and cold behavior. You know, let's say mom one day is in a super good mood when the kid comes home from school, and then the next day, same thing, because children, they really want consistency, right? They build a lot of safety through consistency, through routine, through doing the same thing. And let's just say the next day they come home from school and then mom or dad is presenting as a completely different person because perhaps maybe they're intoxicated. What happens now is the child, A, starts to feel confused. B, their sense of safety and routine gets threatened. So they're coming home expecting Monday's mom, and now Tuesday's mom is either half in the bag or super cranky or stressed out and maybe snaps at the kid. You know, maybe the kid starts to pick up on slurring, or mom's just acting a lot differently, and children don't have the capacity to understand what's going on. So all of these things, and just as a side note, attachment trauma, I think when we hear the word trauma, or for myself anyways, in the past, I used to think I can't talk about my issues, or my issues can't be that big because I never experienced trauma. Because my old view in my 20s, let's say, around trauma was either physical or sexual abuse. That's where my mind would go when I think about trauma. And I hadn't learned about complex trauma yet, and what that can look like. And what complex trauma can be is, even if it's tiny, small microaggressions, or tiny bits of emotional neglect day in, day out, year after year. Let's say verbal violence in a relationship, verbal aggression. Trauma does not mean that somebody has to put their hands on you for you to be traumatized. I know a lot of people who have endured just awful behavior from primary caregivers, unfortunately, that were very sick themselves and were not able to get the help that they needed while they were raising children. And for anybody in my generation or older, we all know that none of this was talked about, right? I only first started to hear about codependency like 15, 17 years ago. And it was still such a brand new term. We really did not talk very much about attachment styles, if at all. And it was just like, okay, if you grew up and you weren't beaten, and you weren't sexually abused, then you have nothing to complain about, which is such a backwards, re-traumatizing way of looking at things, because the more and more that I work with individuals and learn about complex trauma myself, it's actually quite heartbreaking. Emotional neglect really, really, really runs deep. Even children or adolescents or teens that have their weight commented on, for example, when they're growing up. Maybe parents who expect perfection from their kids. And, I work with a lot of recovering perfectionists where if they got an 89, it was kind of like, why aren't you in the 90s? Or, yeah, that's good, but, and that takes a toll on you after a while, because this subconscious message gets created of, when I try my best, it's not good enough. And that translates to, I'm not good enough. But really, if we're looking at that situation objectively, whoever's making that comment is actually the one who isn't good enough for themselves. Because people who feel content inside and are stable and peaceful inside don't make comments like that. People who feel, it happened yesterday. I was with someone and we went to the counter to pay for something, and the person said, "Wow, you lost so much weight," to the woman working at the counter, the person I was with. "You look great." And I just turned to them, and I didn't even care who was in the waiting room. I was like, "We don't say that anymore." And they were like, "Why? I'm giving them a compliment. They look great." And I was like, I didn't say all this at the counter. Once we got in the car, I was like, "No, you're complimenting them on their weight loss, which means you look good because you lost weight." And we don't know, right? We don't know if that person has been struggling. We don't know if this person is unwell physically. All that message sends is, wow, I noticed you now, and I noticed you look really good because you lost weight. So what does that mean the next time if you see the person and you don't comment on their weight? It's one of the biggest reasons I do not talk about weight when I see people. I used to do it. I used to have it done to me my entire life, and it became such an obsession for me that I would start to comment on other people's weight when I saw them. So in my 20s, for example, when I was just like obsessed with fitness and I was only going to be okay if I was super, super thin, I would see people and I'd be like, "Oh, wow, you look great. You look so fit. You look this, blah, blah, blah." But it's like, it's boring to me now. It is the last thing that interests me now about somebody. Nor is it any of my business to comment on, and I don't want it commented on about me, right? It's really like, "Hey, how's it going? How's that new project you started?" Whatever it is, right? Like a lot of us have this script where it's weight, what do you do for a living, money, politics. I'm bored of all of it. Tell me what's going on. Tell me like something exciting that you're doing this summer. Tell me, a friend of mine called last night, and I made a very bold move last night. I am not going to publicly talk about it, but I was really impressed with myself. I really went out of my comfort zone and did something I would never normally do. And my friend called last night, and I told him about it, and we were just howling about it, like those are the moments. Those are like the important things that we can encourage each other on, rather than what you look like or how much money you make. So anyways, I went off on a little bit of a tangent there. Back to anxious attachment style. Basically, a child grows up in a very unstable environment. So I've used the example of alcoholic, substance abuser mom or dad, but it can also be, let's say, mental health struggles. Let's say mom or dad are struggling with their own depression, anxiety, PTSD, narcissism. Say they were raised by narcissism, right? Like, this is where we really start to get into that whole snowball effect of passing on the generational trauma. Because really, we don't just breed a narcissist out of nowhere, right? If you take a look at that individual and look at the way that they were raised, 9 times out of 10, they're going to be raised by somebody highly narcissistic as well. So what does that mean? That their needs were never met in childhood. They were never taught how to self-regulate. So once they have children, you cannot pass on something that you don't have. So a lot of the times this is what happens. So let's say mom or dad are struggling, or maybe they struggle with borderline personality disorder. The child has no idea what's going on, right? Very rarely do I hear families sitting down at dinner talking openly about their mental health struggles. Again, especially not with the older generations. So the kid comes home, and again, they don't know what they're walking into. So that in itself is very damaging for a child. But even worse, what happens now is that that child starts to develop strategies to fix things. So I often talk about how adult people pleasers start off as parent pleasers. So what happens is that if a kid comes home and mom is always sad, the kid's going to try to make mom happier. And the kid's going to come home and they're going to start scanning their environment. What's going on here? Is everything safe here? Is mom in a good mood? Is mom in a bad mood? And then it's like, what does mom need? And this can happen young. I mean, this can happen 5 years old, 6 years old. So now, instead of the child, let's say, coming home from school, for example, and doing what normal kids should be doing, excited for their snack. Maybe they get to play with their friends outside for 2 hours, then it's homework, then it's dinner, then it's bath, then it's bed, right? Going back to the importance of structure and routine. They're coming home instead and thinking, shit, how can I make mom in a better mood? How can I be perfect so dad doesn't rage out? How can I, or maybe stay out of everybody's way, right? We're going to border more into an avoidant attachment style at that point, but let's hide out. Worst one of all, right? We want to talk about where codependence really comes from. Let's pretend that we don't have any needs. So say, for example, like I was talking about insecure attachment, say, for example, that child got teased at school that day, or got their lunch stolen, or whatever. I sound so old right now. I don't know what happens in elementary school anymore. I'm sure that still goes on, but it is terrified. I remember once, this is so embarrassing. I remember once I don't even know. I think I was like in grade 3 or 4, and I saw these 2 grade 6ers kissing in the forest. And I don't know what came over me. I'm not a little rat. This is really not my personality. But I went and I told the teacher that they were kissing in the forest. And this girl chased me around school for I don't even know how long. And I remember being terrified of her. I was hiding in the gymnasium behind the curtains from her. I was trying to avoid her at all costs. And I just knew that I wasn't going to be able to go home and talk about something like that. So what happens a lot of the times with these children is they experience things during the day, but talking about them at home it's not happening for whatever reason. So the child learns now to stuff the need. So we can hear things like, oh, it's not a big deal, or I don't want to make mom or dad more upset, or they're going through their own stuff. I don't want to burden them, right? That's one of the number one patterns that I see today in codependent adults is this inability to even know what their needs are, right? The majority of times that I ask a client, what are your needs in a relationship? What are your personal day-to-day needs? They look at me like I have two heads. They have no idea. And that's not because they're not intelligent. That's not because of anything. That's because of a strategy that was developed many, 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 many years ago. Right? When I'm hyper focused on what you need or what a parent needs, I cannot focus on what I need. I don't even care. My focus now, my job now is to help you. And when somebody does that long enough, I work with people in their 60s who have come out of marriages where they've only focused on their parents' needs growing up, and then boom, went from living at home to living with a partner, and then hyper focusing on their needs for the next 30 years. You want to talk about complex trauma and the psychological damage that comes from that. It's heartbreaking because we really just, not only do we not know what we need, even if we did know, we're terrified to ask for it. An anxiously attached individual will function under the premise that if they do bring a need to the table, they're going to be left. They're going to be abandoned. The need is not going to be met. So they just stuff and stuff and stuff and stuff. But the very tricky part of anxious attachers is that they come off as, heavy people pleasers, heavy codependents. They're very, very attuned to what other people need. A lot of the times why an avoidant will be so attracted to them at first. But the tricky thing about anxious attachment is that there is an invisible expectation underneath all of the pleasing. So a lot of the times people will find somebody, you hear a lot about like rescuing or fixing. An anxious person will find somebody that looks like they need help, or maybe their life is a bit of a mess for whatever reason. Maybe they're alcoholic or addicted to drugs. The anxious attacher will swoop in with their superhero cape because that's what they've learned in childhood, and they're going to get to work fixing. But they're not unconditionally loving fixing. They're fixing with a motive. So the narrative often looks like, I'm going to give and give and give and give until this person is well enough to start giving back to me. It's the ultimate trap, right? Because anxious attachers 9.999 times out of 10 are giving people, and 9 out of 10 times they're attracted to takers. And for whatever reason, maybe the person isn't inherently a taker, but for anybody who knows what struggling with alcoholism or drug addiction looks like, you are a taker. I don't know any giving alcoholics. You're struggling, who are in active addiction, not in sobriety. active addiction, you can't really focus on giving to somebody else. You are so engulfed with the addiction at that point that you just take and take and take and take and take what you can get. So the tricky thing about anxious attachers is that they find these fixer-uppers, let's say, for lack of a better term, and the resentment starts building. Because especially if, say, for example, they get into partnerships with people who don't know how to communicate, let's say, for example, and this person, the anxious attacher, really values communication, it doesn't work that way. You're not going to help this person to become a better communicator. If, for example, the person that you do end up with says to you, hey, I really want to work on my communication skills, I'm going to do that in individual therapy, or let's do that together, fine. That's a whole other ballgame. But if you're taking somebody who's not actively engaged in any type of therapeutic work or coaching work to become a stronger communicator, then that's a fantasy on the anxious attacher's part. So anxious attachment in a nutshell will look like an individual who has never really had their needs met, so in turn becomes an adult who doesn't know what they need. And when you don't know what you need as an adult, especially in dating, you're throwing spaghetti at the wall. You're dating without a plan, you're dating without intention, you are dating to be picked. And I don't know what we're picking because we don't even know what we want, need, or value in that moment. So we're going in blind. And when we go into blind dating, not knowing what we need or want, it's really difficult. The same can go for, I used to apply for jobs. I remember when I graduated university, I used to apply for jobs just for like the title or what it represented or the salary. Never did I once say, hey, does this job match my needs, my values, my view on life? Does it align with my goals? Do I see myself? I remember once somebody asked me, they were like, well, where do you like envision yourself working? Like, what does the office look like? What area are you in? Do you work from home? Do you work at the office? And I just looked at her and I was like, holy shit. I have never asked myself that I didn't even know you could ask yourself that. Never in my life have I asked myself that. I just was like, do you choose me? Am I getting the job or not? And then every single time, what would happen after the hype wore off, right? Because if you don't know what you need or you want, you're just going to go for the score. And the score, like drugs, alcohol, food, shopping, sex, gambling, you name it, the high is going to wear off. And once the high would wear off, I was at this job where I was like, shit, I don't want to work here. Not only is that disrespectful to my time, it's disrespectful to the whole hiring process that people just went through. And I'm probably presenting some avatar of myself lying in the interview just to be able, and like, I'll figure it out. I can figure a lot of things out. I'll figure out how to do the job, but that's not the point. Do I want, like, if my passion isn't in it, then my work is not going to be at 100%. That's for sure. So, going back to the kind of list of characteristics, anxious attachers have a very hard time knowing what they need and value. They very obviously carry a lot of anxiety. Like I said earlier, even in their platonic relationships, if you haven't really been taught how to make friends, how to keep friends, if you haven't been taught that you're enough as a person, you're going to go into any interpersonal relationship and again, just really hope to be chosen or liked or accepted. And unfortunately, when we put when we base our value on something that's outside of ourselves, my God, it's going to be very short lived, right? If my mood depends on my partner's mood or my boss's mood or my friend's mood or my parents' mood, I'm going to be one moody mother effer because people are not stable. That cannot be my source, right? Money cannot be the source. How many times have we seen celebrities get everything they think that they want, and you're watching them overdose and die alone and suicide and all of these things because we're taught so young, go after this and get your dream job and get your dream career. And we're not taught to check inwards and be like, hey, what do I like? What am I good at? What do I gravitate towards? Am I creative? Do I love art? Art to me fascinates me. I'm not going to say the least creative person I know because I'm starting to realize I am creative, but in my own way. But I'm the least artistic person I know. I can't even draw a stick figure. And any of my friends that are artists, you couldn't take that out of them if you tried. It's like singing. The people are, or math, engineers, accountants. It's incredible. Their minds, their brains, they're programmed that way. And it's just so sad that makeup artists, my God, am I bad at putting makeup on? It's incredible. That show Glow Up, like, and it's really heartbreaking. Queer Eye. I remember when I started watching Queer Eye, each story of the all five of them is heartbreaking. Their parents, I think 210 and I forget his other name, a super handsome chef. Anyways, both of their parents do not talk to them. Kick them out of the house and never spoke to them again for being gay. It's complete insanity to me that the amount of people raised in households that what their children come to them with is unacceptable. It's insane. It just poses the question, like, why are you having children then? Why are you having children if you want to control the child's outcome? Do children need guidance? Yes. Structure? Yes. Rules? Yes, for sure. I mean, did my parents love and support and promote the fact that I was a drug addict? Absolutely not. But for anything else I've wanted to do, go for it. If it sparks joy inside, go for it. We need to start honoring what it is that we're drawn to without thinking like, yeah, of course, society, it's expensive today to live. We want to make a living, but we also want to be happy. There's a lot of people I know working jobs where it's like just living in survival mode, collecting that paycheck every 2 weeks. It's brutal. Anyways, again, getting very way off topic. It's very hard for me to do short episodes. I said I was going to do short episodes, and I don't think I'm going to be able to do it, guys. Bear with me. Back to the list of characteristics: anxious attachers, not knowing who they are, very low self-worth, low self-esteem, a lot of nervous system dysregulation. That's a big one too. When you grow up in a home that is not regulated or with parents that don't know how to regulate their own nervous system, the child never learns to be able to feel safe in their own body or their own home. And that is a big, big, big quality of anxious attachers, especially as they age. And you'll see that a lot with the perfectionists or the people who are chronically busy. Right? I used to just think that I was like really hyper and that I would just run from thing to thing to thing to thing to thing. But underneath that was me being terrified when the noise would stop, or I wasn't busy, what was going to come up. So a lot of nervous system dysregulation. So what happens is that they can control their lives when they are very busy, or say they're kind of lost in that perfectionism. If you take a people pleasing, codependent, anxious attacher, there's no stopping them in what they're going to be able to achieve. That's never the problem that people come to me with, right? Like I said before, relentless. They will study, even if they're not necessarily good at it. They're going to get that degree. They're going to get that job. They're going to save that money. They're going to, right? This is not an achievement issue. This is what happens usually when that noise starts to calm down and they want to start to get into a relationship. They start dating and they're like, oh my God, something is happening. Why do I feel so in control? And I'm using air quotes. Why do I feel so in control when it comes to work, finances, keeping my condo spotless, whatever it is? But then as soon as I get into a relationship, I feel insane. Well, for all the reasons that I just listed, because in relationships, you're not in control, and it requires a lot of trust and a lot of vulnerability and a lot of things that are highly uncomfortable for people who have never practiced that. So those are anxious attachers. I'm going to start zipping through the other ones. Otherwise, we're going to be on here for an hour and a half. Then we're going to move into avoidant, often known as avoidant dismissive attachment styles. So an avoidant child can grow up in a home. One of the number one complaints that I hear from avoidants is they were raised by a highly critical or maybe two critical parents, but usually one of the two. So either mom, super critical, dad, super critical, and the child not being able to do anything right or having an opinion of their own. So a lot of the times they would come home as kids, for example, and the mom or the dad would just be going off about something, or perhaps they were making it all about them. Maybe everything was very, very rigid, and the child had to either agree with the parents or go along with their plans or what they wanted to do. A lot of self-centeredness, right? If mom or dad were very, very self-centered and it was all about them, what can happen is a child can start to get really resentful and essentially start to keep a lot of things to themselves, but not in a way of hiding their needs, in a way of, I can't trust a very highly critical person, so I'm just going to deal with it myself. I've worked with people and had people personally in my life who grew up in violent homes. And a lot of the times the child would just go off on their own. I knew somebody that would hide under the stairs for hours just to hide from their father when he was in a rageful state. And what happens is those type of kids grow up into adults who are hyper, hyper, hyper independent. So to them, going to somebody else to help them solve a problem is not really in their repertoire. They're going to fix it themselves. They've taught themselves other people are critical, other people are not safe, are not to be trusted. I'm going to deal with this. And it's none of these are good or bad, but when we lean too far into avoidance or when we lean too far into anxiety, that's when it can start to create problems especially in personal relationships. So avoidant characteristics, like I mentioned, hyper independent, really not super comfortable with big emotions, very, very, very sensitive to criticism, to the point where they will shut down. They will need to go and isolate until they start to feel better. Now, an anxious person can also be sensitive to criticism, but what happens is, and I'll do a separate podcast episode on the strategies, but what will happen if an anxious person feels attacked or criticized, they'll want to go head to head in the moment. They'll be like, no way. We're going to talk about this. You've hurt my feelings. I'm dysregulated. And now we need to fix this immediately. Where the avoidant will get their feelings hurt, or they'll start to hear, say they're partnered with an anxious attacher, they'll start to hear the anxious person complaining, you're working too much, or I never see you, or I feel like you don't care about me. And what will happen is they won't necessarily hear what the anxious person's saying. They're just going to be reminded of the criticism that they received when they're younger. And what will happen is they will just go into a shutdown state. So they actually need to go and run and hide. And I always call it like their avoidant cave to regulate their nervous system again. And then once they've made sense of it in their heads, because avoidant people are much better at self-regulation than anxious people. Anxious people tell themselves, and this isn't actually what they need, but when they're activated, they tell themselves that they need another person to help them regulate their nervous system. So they need to co-regulate, but actually it's the opposite. Anxious people need to work on their ability to self-regulate because they're panicking when they're triggered. And avoidants actually need to practice the art of co-regulation because when they're triggered, they want to go and hide out and make sense of all their problems on their own until they feel safe enough to go back to the person that criticized them. So again, not good or bad, right or wrong, but it is a disaster when an anxious person is dating an avoidant when both of their strategies are activated. People ask me all the time, can it work? Can an anxious and an avoidant work? Of course. And the majority of times, an anxious person is going to end up with somebody who's more avoidant because anxious and anxious don't work well together. The only time I see that or used to see that a lot is the clients leaving the rehab or in the rehab, they would, fall in love, which is a disaster waiting to happen. And they would take off together. And oftentimes they would both be very anxious leaning. But again, you're in rehab, you're 2 months sober, you have no idea what's going on. You're very attracted to somebody. There's a lot of chemistry and lust, and they take off together and they realize there's just too much anxiety bouncing off of each other. And then two avoidants don't end up often together because those strategies just don't work that well. There would probably be a lot of rupture and not a lot of repair because both people would be kind of in their caves and nobody would be humble enough to kind of initiate the reconnect. So oftentimes anxious people end up with more avoidant leaning people. And I won't get into the why for this episode, but I will do another episode on the pairings of attachment styles and the good and the bad, what that can look like. But essentially, avoidant characteristics are hyper-independence, sensitive to criticism, tendency to isolate. They have a very strong tendency to feel overwhelmed, almost suffocated by somebody who at first they feel very useful being there for someone, especially somebody who's more anxious. But then what happens is once the avoidant is with that person and wants to chill out a little bit, they kind of go back to their ways. A lot of avoidants are workaholics. They stick with something that's very safe to them and they do it well and they do it for a long time because they're kind of the captain of the ship in that department. Nobody's bothering them. They kind of run the show. But what happens is that if they're paired with an anxious person who needs them at the beginning and they can feel really good about that, once they go back to kind of, every relationship is going to go through their honeymoon stage and then it's going to regulate as it should. But the anxious person, if it's not a healthy partnership and if the avoidant can't clearly communicate what's happening, the avoidant's going to go back to doing what they do, and the anxious person is going to get more and more and more activated and try to get them to help them calm their nervous system. And then the avoidant's going to say like, oh, this is too much, you're too needy, I need peace in relationships, I need calm in relationships. And what that really means is I can't handle your anxiety, so I need somebody who's going to kind of leave me alone. So what happens is those two strategies start really bouncing off of each other in a very negative way. So that would all need to be kind of ironed out and talked about in a healthier relationship. And unfortunately, I mean, this is more of a personal opinion, but I see a lot more anxious people wanting to do the work and wanting to improve their negative traits of their attachment styles than the avoidance. Because again, the avoidance, they like to stay in a groove and they're not experiencing the same type of anxiety as an anxious attacher. So if it's like an alcoholic is only going to change if they've hit a bottom. Avoidance don't really hit the same bottoms as anxious attachers because they tend to just kind of isolate and figure out their own stuff. So I work with a lot more anxious people than I do avoidance, but I have seen people do really well in like couples therapy and partners of anxious attachers who really want to learn more about their avoidance strategies, that they can really, it's all about communication, right? Once an anxious person can get across to the avoidant that it's not criticism and that they need A, B, and C, and maybe they weren't clear about that at the beginning of the relationship, the avoidant can say like, oh, okay, so you're not saying I'm not good enough, because that's what they can hear, right? They're just going to picture mom or dad saying, you're not good enough for me, or you're not doing a good enough job. But it's not that. It's the anxious person is trying to say, hey, I want to spend more quality time with you, or hey, can you work 12 hours instead of 14 hours today? Whatever it is. So a lot of communication is needed with those two styles. But in a nutshell, avoidance, tend to isolate more, sensitive to criticism, have a difficult time with high levels of vulnerability. Yeah. And quick, disorganized attachment style, you're getting into a hybrid of both. So the person doesn't necessarily lean all the way anxious or all the way avoidant. What happens with disorganized individuals like myself is that depending on who they're with and what environment they're in, they can switch back and forth. So in the past, I've had people, for example, even securely attached individuals, one person really interested in having a relationship with me at the time, and I was kind of all over the place. I didn't know what I wanted, and their openness and their vulnerability scared the shit out of me, and I completely shut down. So I would move right into more avoidant territory to try to keep myself safe. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, I have been with people who were so completely avoidant, they didn't even know what way was up, or just very emotionally unavailable. And that would trigger the hell out of my anxiety because it would remind me of relationships growing up. And what would happen would that kind of like was the push-pull dynamic of that relationship, and that is extremely anxiety provoking and just really not healthy for either party. So disorganized is really this hybrid of both, and it's tricky. A disorganized attachment style is probably the trickiest one to treat out of all of them, but again, at the end of the day, despite what attachment style you lean towards, the answer is always the same. It's finding a deeper sense of inward security, getting a lot more clarity around your needs, your goals, your values, who you are, your non-negotiables, what you're okay with, what you're not okay with, and also the people that you choose to surround yourself by, and especially the people that you choose to date. Now, I don't hide the anxiety or the disorganization that I can experience sometimes. If I'm going to trust somebody and if I'm going to let them into my life today, they know about that, right? Because it's not something that I feel paralyzed by anymore, but it's definitely something that's going to come up again in the future. You know, a lot of people say, when am I going to feel fully secure? When am I going to fix my attachment style? And it's not about fixing anything. I say this often. We don't fix anything because nothing's broken. They're just a set of strategies that I don't have to use as much anymore, because I'm not trying to convince somebody of anything anymore. I'm not trying to coerce somebody to stay with me anymore. So now my job is to find an appropriate person that I can be myself with, that knows my triggers, that knows why and what is coming up and for what reason. And are we going to fight? Sure. We're going to have arguments? Sure. This is real life. It's never about getting rid of all of that. But again, it's the repair that comes afterwards. So disorganized is really just a hybrid version of all the characteristics that I mentioned before. But I think even just involves even a little bit even more work than just anxious or avoidant tendencies. It's really pointing to a lot of hot and cold behavior as a kid. And what can happen is that the adult, after experiencing a lot of that as a child, an adult can grow up being attracted, and I know this is going to sound very counterintuitive, but the disorganized adult can be very attracted to a person's hot and cold behavior. And if you're going to partner up with somebody who's hot and cold, you're in for a roller coaster ride, right? I don't know about you guys, but that's not what I want to be in at all. Does everybody have bad days? Yes. Does everybody go through period of, well, not everybody, but can you go through periods of depression or anxiety? Yes, it's not about that. We're talking about like mood swings up and down, never know what you're going to get. Not a healthy pairing for a disorganized person at all. So really focusing on learning how to self-regulate, what that looks like, and more importantly, building a life of structure that comes first. Because what happens more times than not with disorganized attachment or anxious attachment is once they get into relationships, they stop doing all the things that they were doing before they met the person, because now they're putting the other person's needs first, or they're working around their schedule, or they're whatever it is. No, none of that, right? Like, of course, yes, we're going to compromise, but it's super, super, super important for anybody anxious leaning or disorganized leaning to continue to have that structure in place. If you've been working out every morning and that's working for you, keep doing it, whether you're in a relationship or not. Do you go to your yoga or book club once a week with the girls or the guys? Continue doing that. Don't stop doing these things for somebody else or hoping that you can fit into their schedule, because especially disorganized people, we really need that structure that helps us with our self-esteem and with our nervous system regulation. Because, you know, for somebody like me, if I stop working out, if I am eating unhealthy all the time, if if my sleep schedule's off, if any of these things are off, I start to become unraveled inside. And then that is going to translate into my relationship. And I'm going to start projecting the instability that I feel onto the other person. And then we're just looking for a fight at that point. So probably number one tip for disorganized people, keep the structure very clean, even when you start to date or when you start to get into a relationship. Guys, it's been 59 minutes. I really wanted to do a simple attachment style 101. The plan in my mind was this was going to be a 20-minute back to basic, very simple rundown of attachment styles. It's an hour. I hope it was clear. Let me know your feedback. I can talk about this for days on end. Next week or in 2 weeks, I'll hop back on and I'll talk a lot about the pairings of attachment styles, which ones work better, what's important for each person to work on or to talk about. And as always, if there's anything else you want to know about or hear about or want me to talk about, you just let me know. And thank you all for listening and supporting this podcast. I'm starting to have just more and more fun with it each week and just building a community with you guys. It's been great. So thanks for listening, and I will see you again in a couple of weeks.
Thanks everyone for listening and supporting Living Out Loud. Be sure to tune in next week for another fun, juicy episode.